You're listening to the Hello World podcast, number 46. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. On today's show is Rocky Lhotka. Rocky is the CTO of Magenic and the creator of the widely used CSLA.NET development framework. He's the author of numerous books and regularly speaks at major conferences around the world. Rocky is a Microsoft regional director and an MVP. Magenic is a company that specializes in planning, designing, building, and maintaining your enterprise's most mission-critical systems. For more information, go to www.lhotka.net. A bunch of years ago, Rocky and I both worked for the same company, Magenic. But even before then, we were running into each other at conferences, both talking about data access. And he's still doing it. Today's show, we talked about his early life and how he wanted to be an Air Force pilot, and how that ended up as a software engineer. Let's take a listen. I'm really happy to have Rocky Lhotka on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. We've run into each other for I don't know how many years now. We used to both talk about data access quite a bit, and then I got drawn into other things. You're still working on versions of the objects books. Is that right?
I am, although I've switched to complete online self-publishing now.
Nice.
Be able to turn them out faster than you can through a traditional publisher. So
that's certainly true. Well, that's awesome. So you, like a lot of the other people that are on the show, I'm always interested in how you got started. Were you sort of that traditional, I got a computer as a kid and it's been that way ever since? Or what was your story like?
Well, maybe a little different in that I grew up in central Minnesota and in the middle of hundreds and hundreds of acres of forest and lakes. And so my first interaction with technology was probably more building a depth finder, for being out in a boat and seeing how deep the bottom is from a Heath kit. A lot of soldering and running wires together, and that was kind of my probably my first introduction to at least electronic technology.
Sure.
And
was that really for fishing or for more boating?
It was more for fishing. Yep. Like I said, I grew up in the middle of lakes and forests. I was and still am an avid outdoorsman.
Oh, nice. And was it a kit for doing this, or was it an electronics kit and you figured out how to do that?
No, it was a kit specifically for that purpose. So the kit came with all the electronic components and the board and the case and all the pieces, but it all had to be put together.
Wow.
And it was a good project that my dad and my brother and I did.
That's fun, and you get to learn to solder and all those things that those darn kids don't know how to do anymore.
Yeah, it's at least do it in a practical sense. And growing up in the country, we were always fixing tractors and cars and that sort of thing too. But this kind of ignited a lot of interest because it was such a different thing than getting all greasy and pulling out parts of tractors. So,
and where did that lead?
Well, ultimately, my high school had access through a 110 baud modem.
Nice.
On a terminal that printed paper, scrolling paper to a cyber mainframe. And this is, in the days when, at the time, Minnesota was a major tech hub because cyber technologies and Honeywell and others were centered here. And so cyber was a Minnesota based mainframe company. That's before IBM kind of took over the world.
Yeah.
And so we had access to this through the education system at like I said, 110 baud. We would dial literally pick up a rotary phone, dial the number, and then and then we would set the headset of the phone in those suction cups, because the audio for the carrier signal was going through the phone's headset into a box that sat on the desk where you'd insert the earpiece and head, or mouthpiece of the thing into and then that would translate, and we were able to log in through this. I went through a lot of paper.
I'm sure. So there wasn't any screen. It was just you typing, and that would show up on paper, and what came out on paper as well.
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Luckily, it was widescreen paper, so I would run it through 4 times.
Oh, nice.
So,
front, back, left, and right. Yeah.
The school, the first time I ran through a couple boxes of paper, the school was like, whoa, hey, you can't be doing that. And so then I learned quick that if I wanted to spend as much time as I wanted to on the computer, I had to reuse the paper by rotating it and flipping it,
And can we even describe what 110 baud was like to people that are complaining that they only have 10 megabits to the house, or 10 gigabit is coming to everybody's house? I mean,
probably the fascinating. Best way the best way I think to think about it, Sean, is you can type faster.
That's true.
So all the data that we had access to was coming through this thing slower than I could type. So.
That is funny. And were you writing, were you doing like basic on the Cyber, or was this really just you were running different applications running on the mainframe?
Well, to start with, I was just running different applications, as you might guess, probably mostly games.
Sure, that's what you would guess. Where we all started.
I think that's true. And then, yes, it was basic. And about the time I really started to get interested in how to make this software was also the time that we got our first integer apples. So those were before they had floating point CPUs.
Oh, wow.
But these were the old original Apple apples. And then later we got Apple with floating point and Apple IIs. And ultimately my first computer that I actually owned was an Apple IIe, I think.
Oh, okay. So you had lowercase. That was a big deal back then.
Yeah, lowercase and floating point math, and it was the
everything you could possibly need. 32K and 110 baud modem. You were set.
Oh, totally! It was very exciting. I think by that point we'd probably gotten to 300 baud modem, so we were really going fast.
Moore's law and all that, yeah. And so, were you still in high school when this happened? When you got the Apple IIe?
Right. Well, I got the Apple IIe right as I graduated from high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And did you go to college knowing you wanted to be, a software guy, or did you start doing this, outside the home, as it were, for other people?
No, I went to college once I could drive. I would, because we lived, like I said, out in the country, but I would drive into town, and the people at the school would let me use the computers even in the summer. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do a lot of things. Basically it was myself and one of the high school teachers, Byron Johnson, who was one of the math teachers. He and I were to a large degree learning together.
Yeah.
And because nobody else knew anything about how to do this. So we would, and it's kind of, strange in a sense, because of course he was an adult and I was a teenager, but we would compare notes on how to do different kinds of sorting or algorithms, or because one of us would discover something and share it with the other one. So it was kind of a neat thing. And
this was a period when there was this push, or at least I'm guessing it was when I was in high school. There was a big push to convert up on math teachers and science teachers into some computer teachers, or they'd have a lab and they'd find a math teacher to be, math, therefore you must, you're going to run the computer room for the students and all of that.
Oh, that's exactly right. And I think by the time I was a senior in high school, Mr. Johnson actually had a computer lab and was starting to teach. There was some sort of Pascal compiler that ran on the Apple II computers. And so he was starting to teach the very first actual computer science, computer programming classes that our school had.
Nice.
I never took that because, again, he and I were, neck and neck as to what we knew. So the class itself, by that point for me, was not so interesting.
Sure.
Then when I did go to college, I was in love with computers. There's no doubt about it. But my first run at college, I actually went to the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs because I wanted to fly jets. That was what I really wanted to do. As you and I have met in person numerous times, so you know that I'm not a short person. It turns out there are height requirements, like
height
you can't be taller than and I far exceed those. So
the seat doesn't go all the way back, as you might imagine.
Well, they really build those things for smaller people. That's all there is to it.
Did you know about these height requirements before you went to the academy?
Not completely. They don't necessarily tell you all the ins and outs and details. People, and I did this too, go through growth spurts, in their late teens, early 20s. And so literally when I went in, I was just under the height requirements.
Oh, wow.
And a year later, I was beyond the height requirements. So, things change.
They do. And did you end up serving in the Air Force, or did you just go to the academy for a while?
I just went to the academy for a year, and then there's an opportunity to leave at that point after the first year, and I took that because if I wasn't going to get to fly, especially in the Air Force at that time, the primary alternative was to work in a missile silo, probably in the middle of North Dakota. And that didn't seem particularly compelling.
No.
Although
in hindsight,
I have a lot of respect for the people that did that.
Yeah.
But, I wanted to pursue if I couldn't fly, I wanted to pursue computers. And, the better way to do that was to go out into a, regular conventional university. So
that makes sense. And did you decide at that point to go for a computer science degree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No question. And, I know a lot of college students go in and switch majors several times, and my oldest son has switched his once already. But I never did. I was very, very single-minded as to what I wanted. So I went in and at that time, it was pretty common for universities to use DEC-VAX computers.
Yeah.
And our college, certainly, that was the basis for all of our education at that time. So green screen terminals and mainframes were generally too expensive for educational institutions.
Yeah.
So
they were really big money.
And so Minnesota's university system had a mainframe, but each university did not. So every university had a VAX. And then there were a couple classes that I took that dealt with mainframes, but we would interact with the VAX and then submit batch jobs to the mainframe. And so my exposure to the IBM style mainframes was extremely limited and indirect, and which is fine. I don't regret never having gotten into that. I liked the VAX a lot. In the first and second years, really, of my professional career out of college, my jobs, either directly or indirectly, dealt with DEC VAXs. And so I was able to directly leverage the experience that I'd had in college as I went into my career, and worked with Pascal and Fortran and BASIC, at the time, all pretty mainstream, widely used languages. And I think one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people seem to go to college, especially universities, and the universities focus a lot on, especially computer science focuses on the algorithms and a lot of the basic kind of the building blocks on which you would build software, and you might go and do an awful lot of your classwork in Python, which is not terribly useful in an enterprise computing space.
Sure.
And I'm not picking on Python.
It's just what happens. A lot of people are using today in CS programs.
Yeah, it's quite popular. Or C++, which is also not widely used unless you're building operating systems, drivers, or games.
Right.
And I think that's fine. I know there's a lot of back and forth. I got very lucky in that, although in college we'd used Pascal, and I never used that on the VAX professionally. It ended up being Fortran and VAX Basic, which was not the basic that people think of. It was pretty cool, but but I got to use at least some of my skills directly applied. But really, to me, the value was in all that base level knowledge about algorithms and data structures and the way computers manage memory, and those concepts have remained valuable as I've moved off VAXes onto Windows and dabbled in Unix and done some C, C++, Visual Basic, C#, all the different things that I've done. And so I often think about this because it seems, especially in the last few years, to be a lot of hue and cry about, boy, these universities need to turn out students that are ready to go into industry. And on one level, I think that's true. But on the other level, our industry changes relatively rapidly, and curriculums are hard to build. Textbooks are hard to acquire. And even if you look over the last decade, if your college taught Java, you could end up working in .NET or vice versa.
Sure.
And so is it even practical to think are you supposed to know when you're 17 years old entering college that you want to be a JavaScript developer or a .NET developer? I mean, that's absurd, right?
Right.
So it's, I think, much more important for these universities to teach these broader concepts that are applicable regardless of programming language or platform.
And that seems to happen in a lot of other types of programs where, I don't have a degree, so I'll start the caveat with that. But I talk to a lot of people, and they come out of college with the idea that they learned how to learn. Right, that the skill they gained in college was this ability to be able to accumulate information, distill the information, and then improve what they're doing based on that. And it has that same feeling, I think, to me, that it would be nice to leave college with these skills where you could immediately get a job and all of that. But at some level, you're trying to prepare these people for being good at what they do for 20 years, not being good at what they do for 2 years. It's more of almost a technical school philosophy at the university level, or at least that's what I hear, those same sort of beck and calls.
That's certainly my view on it. But like you said, you don't have a degree. I've got a lot of people that I work with or friends of mine that have either not a computer degree. They've got a degree in history or physics or and other people that have 2-year degrees, tech school. And all of the people that I'm thinking of as we're talking here are just amazing developers. But so I do think that it helps to start with certain, different kinds of base level education and whatnot. But ultimately, it does come down to, do you know how to learn, and do you have the love of learning necessary to keep up with the continual change in our industry?
Because it's not like civil engineering or even, mechanical engineering, where there may be new things. There's a whole churn of knowledge, every 2-3 years, maybe even faster than that for some people, of what they're doing. And certainly there's going to be a core of people that are still making a living maintaining VB3 apps, but the reality is a vast majority of them have moved on to something else.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And how did that impact the decisions you made? You said you were doing VAX Basic, and then I think you said Pascal, if I remember right. No, Fortran, in your first couple of jobs. When you moved on to that and you saw the landscape changing, did that come as a surprise, or was it an opportunity of, ooh, this is something new because I'm bored?
A little of each, because what happened in my case was that I got out of college, got a job programming at an ISV, built vertical software to run concrete ready-mix companies, kind of like an ERP system, although that term didn't exist at the time, but an ERP system for concrete ready-mix. And that was all VAX. Actually, I was helping port the software off an older PDP 11 onto the shiny new VAX. That was how I got hired, actually. And that was a wonderful experience. And then I left that job and went to work for a biomedical manufacturing company. And originally that company was all VAX based. But this was the time that PCs were sneaking into companies. And I don't say that lightly, because that's really what happened. One day we, working at T department, show up and somebody up in accounting has bought a PC because they thought it would be more productive. And then the next thing you know, somebody in manufacturing, one of the managers, had bought a PC. And a different kind. And pretty soon there's all these PCs, different brands. Some work, some don't. Some upgrade, some don't. At the time, none of them were running Windows. They were all running DOS. And then we started running, so some of them were running Lotus 1-2-3, and some of them started running Excel, which did require that Windows would boot just far enough to run Excel and
then close it all down.
And it was, it was kind of chaos. And ultimately and I actually temporarily switched out of software development. I had just switched into the help desk, kind of a career switch out of building software. And thankfully that was temporary. But what we ended up doing was kind of laying down the law with the PCs and saying, people can't just buy their own PCs and bring them in, because what people were doing was buying cheap PCs that would just stop and freeze, or buying PCs that had pirated software, and it was a serious mess.
Yeah.
And so we said, okay, all PC purchases had to come through IT. We had developed a standard install for DOS and Windows, and started making sure that we had interchangeable parts, because the cost of dealing with all the different vendors, that people were working with was just prohibitive. And
it sounds like the whole bringing in your tablets these days, right?
Oh, it's an analogy I use all the time, Sean. I think it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
If somebody brings in their $79 Android tablet that they bought at Lowe's, are you really going to make your enterprise software work on that? And
hopefully not.
I think it's a real question that we have to face now, because it's not unlike the question that if you went and bought some cobbled together PC, that your neighbor or your cousin built as a kit back then, was that really worthy of running your company on? And
risking your
at that time,
company
the answer was no.
Yeah, absolutely. And what made you switch back from the help desk story, back into development? Were you getting, the itch for procedural code?
Yeah, basically. I spent about 2 years running the help desk network administration. We rolled out the ArcNet, because this predated Ethernet. ArcNet network throughout the company, and there were a lot of interesting challenges, but ultimately I love building software, and this probably through our conversation will be a recurring theme.
Of course.
That was one of my first dalliances in thinking about something else, and it was okay, but I really wanted to go back and build software, and so ultimately we rearranged our staff, so I ended up running the software development group, and somebody else took over the help desk and made my life almost infinitely better. That's,
I'm sure, as a software developer, that's sure the way it sounds, when you're working in a company. I get to touch code or work with developers again. That's where that comes from. Did you find early on that working with and leading or even managing software teams was something you were drawn to as well?
To some degree. This was still early in my career, and on a career track, if you will, right? Every time I had a chance to get a promotion, I took a promotion, and every time I got a chance to climb, I would climb. And so obviously, if you're a developer, the place that you climb is into managing developers. That's a logical first step,
of course.
And that was okay. It was not great. I really enjoy making the software more than I enjoy, because we were a relatively small company, so I was not just managing the development staff, but also acting as a business analyst, and my boss and I ended up triaging all the inbound requests for software enhancements or new projects, and so I spent less time coding than I did interacting with users and doing business analysis, and again, an interesting set of challenges. And I think I look at my experiences running the help desk and doing the software and hardware support, and here doing all this business analysis and helping organize the priorities for the company in terms of software. I wouldn't be where I am without those experiences,
of course.
But at the same time, none of them grabbed me and said, "Hey, you should do this for the next 20 years."
Exactly.
So I kind they were dalliance, if you will. I did them for a while and took what I could out of them in terms of skills and knowledge, and then went back. Ultimately, what I did at that point is I left the manufacturing company and switched into a consulting company so that I could get back, deeply immersed back into coding. This was in 94, I guess, right when Visual Basic 3 had come out, 4 was in the wings, VB and Delphi and Power Builder were kind of the vying for how to be the dominant ways that you'd build Windows software.
Yeah. And is this near the time when you started thinking about CSLA and writing the book and all that, or was that more of an outcome of the work you were doing?
The first run at that was more an outcome of the work I was doing. There's a parallel thread that we haven't talked about, and that is that from all the way through middle school, high school, college, I was involved in speech and debate and public speaking. And in fact, my original train of thought as I graduated high school was that I could somehow be a teacher and be involved in computers. And I thought, eventually I'll go be a professor, right, or something. And
until you found out how much they made, yeah,
pretty much, and get sidetracked by, okay, I could build software and get paid a pretty reasonable amount of money, or I could, not really build software, but I could teach people and I could get paid very little. So, but this is important because now by the time we get to in basically 1996, VB4 and 5 this was that juncture. We could finally do, at the time, remote OLE automation, what later became called DCOM, and create distributed software using COM and Visual Basic. And I was on a project. That's exactly where CSLA started. I was on a project. We ended up using and learning an awful lot about DCOM and Microsoft Transaction Server and how to effectively build distributed systems using those technologies. And going to conferences and talking to people, it was, I guess, pretty obvious that very few people had thought through or had the experience. And I was at a conference at the time it was called VBits. These days it's called VS Live.
Yeah.
And there was a publisher there, Rocks Press, and one of their representatives, he and I ended up talking, and he said, "Well, we're looking for authors." And I said, "Well, I guess I have thought about that sort of thing, writing and certainly speaking." And he said, "Well, tell you what, I'll buy a chapter from you, and if we use it, we use it. If we don't, we don't. And either way, you're going to get paid." And I thought, well, that's a good deal. Although I think they paid like $500, so it wasn't really that much money. But
not once you figured out how long it took you to write a chapter, I'm sure.
No, not really. Right. But I wrote a chapter. They liked it, and I think I wrote a couple more chapters because they said, "Hey, this is good. Can you write some more?" And this was during that project. So by the time that the project was closing down, I'd been working on my own time on some of these concepts, trying to, because when you're in the middle of a project, you don't get to refine your ideas
right
the way you would like, and so.
You're trying to get product out of the door and fix bugs and everything else that has to be done to make a product ship.
So evenings, weekends, I'd been working on refining these ideas, and ultimately I proposed this book back to Rocks Press, and they went round and round on the outline. So the actual outline of that VB5 Business Objects book doesn't really look like what I thought it was going to.
Sure.
I think it worked out better than my original idea.
That's the nature of it, isn't it? I mean,
you hope so, yeah.
Yeah, doesn't always, but you've seen my book, so you know that if they take the first table of contents, it's probably going to be a a bit of a mess.
Yeah, well, that's it's so easy to get off on a tangent if you're working alone, and then you get other people reviewing your concepts, and they're like, "Hey, what about this?" Or, "You sure you want to talk about that?" And that was a good learning experience for me too, just how a book comes together.
And did you find that you had a passion for writing at that point? Because obviously you're still writing, even though some of it's a maturation of that book. But it's still a process that has to happen. Probably you've rewritten the book, a dozen times by now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's true. One of my favorite creative people, J. Michael Straczynski, who's the guy that created Babylon 5, and he's a comic author and does a lot of things. I heard him speak once years ago, and he said that in his mind, the difference between a writer and an author is that a writer writes because they get paid, and an author writes because they can't not write. Right.
Absolutely.
And I've always thought that was for me, that was meaningful, because I got the bug. I like writing, and in particular, I'll tell you what I like about it, and that is that writing, whether it's an article or a chapter or a whole book, forces a formalization of thoughts that most of us never really do otherwise. We learn things and we apply things, but if you want, it's that old saw something to the effect of, if you want to become the best expert in something, you should teach that
to somebody
subject.
else. Yeah.
It's the same thing, because until you try to explain to an unknown consumer of your content, right? This is the thing, right? You don't know who's going to read the book. So you're writing for somebody you'll never meet, and you have to explain to them some sort of complicated concept, either about technology or object-oriented design or whatever it is. And it forces a formalization of thought that I would never achieve otherwise, and I find that very satisfying.
It's an amazing thing when it works out. Sometimes it becomes that bundle of fibers problem where you're like, well, I want to teach them this thought, but this thought is connected to the 34 I have to also teach them. And then, I can't teach them this unless I can assume they know, this, and this. Unless I assume they have a 4-year CS degree, and so when I say, these algorithms or these patterns or this is the way that memory works, if I can assume all that, that's one thing. But especially I found in technical books, that's not the case. You can't. In some cases, you can never assume prior knowledge.
No, that's right. Well, because unless you want to restrict your target audience to a set of elite, highly educated people, which, if you're trying to actually make money off this, you can't do that. Yeah. You have to target everybody.
Absolutely.
Right? And so then you have to assume that people have never heard of this, that, or the other thing, and so you end up explaining. And certainly my first book, that VB5 book, I look back on it and I know a lot of people bought it and really got a lot out of it, but to me, it's kind of a disaster because, I got to chapter, let's say 6 or 7, and realized that in order for what I was talking about in chapter 7 to make any sense, I already had to have covered a complicated idea back in chapter 3, which I had not even talked about. And so then I would go back into chapter 3 and try and kind of retrofit and shoehorn that content in there. And it turns out that it's really hard to debug prose.
Yes, you cannot set breakpoints. Yeah, exactly.
So, so if you objectively read through that book, there's a lot of forward or backward references in the book to concepts that aren't actually there or are there but in a different place, or things that I've gotten much better at as I've written more books over the years, but it's not a skill I ever thought I would have needed.
Absolutely.
So,
well, it's interesting because I think many of us would say the same thing about that. The first couple projects we worked on. If we had a chance to go back and look at that code, I'm not sure that. I think I'd like to remember it the way I remember it, and not to remember it the way it really was.
Yes, that's very true. Yep. I'm not even sure it's only the first couple projects.
I was trying to be charitable.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah, we won't talk about MFC though. There's one question I like to ask people to sort of wrap up, and that is, if you look back at your career, because you've had a long and really successful career, would you make any decisions differently? Do you not necessarily regrets, just the left turn, the job you turned down, or the job you would have taken, or the move you would have taken? Anything like that in your history that would have changed the way you think your career would have been established?
I'm not sure that I would change anything, but I certainly do sometimes think about what ultimately led me down the path to being a Microsoft developer had a lot to do with my experiences in corporate IT and in the ISV world, where the need exists to write software on a platform that's going to remain reasonably stable for maybe 10 or more years.
Sure.
And certainly when I was in college and first got out of college, I was the cocky, elitist. Boy, if we're not doing, at the time it was C, right? If you're not doing C, I'm wasting my time. And of course, I ended up doing Fortran and BASIC.
Exactly.
And I did that at the time just because I had bills to pay. I was getting married. I had rent. You do what you got to do. And I always thought, boy, at some point in the future, I'll get back into, quote unquote, real programming. And so I don't regret any of where I've gone because I think it's wonderful. But at the same time, I kind of wonder, suppose that I had gone down that C route and then C++ and Java and ended up in, because that world is completely unlike the Microsoft world in most ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. It's, cobbled together many different tools and frameworks, things changing all the time. I always characterize the software development world as, in my mind, it's bifurcated into order and chaos. And the order people tend not to crow so much about how elitist they are. They live in largely the Microsoft world and they're just cranking away their work and getting stuff done. And the chaos world tends to be full of high energy people that are confident that what they're doing is really extraordinary. And in many cases, it is truly extraordinary. It just might not be maintainable for a decade.
Right. Or easy to get your head around to someone new in that environment,
Right. Yeah. Are you building software that a average developer can manage and maintain, or are you building software that requires elite understanding to even maintain it?
Yeah.
And so I've often thought, what would it have been like to have gone down that, the road of chaos, been an agent of chaos instead of an agent of order?
That's very funny. That's very funny. Well, it's been great having you on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time out. I know that you're a busy guy these days.
Yeah, I am, but I continue to have a lot of fun, like you said, working on CSLA and books related to it and a lot of speaking. And now, of course, like everything else, working on, I've got CSLA running in Xamarin, so it's on Android and iOS. And,
nice.
It's
a fun world to live in.
Always new fun stuff, right?
Absolutely.
That's the great thing.
Absolutely. Well, you have a great day and enjoy. I assume the weather is lovely there this time of year.
Oh, it is gorgeous. All the trees are colorful, and it's probably my favorite time of year, Sean.
That's lovely. Well, go catch us all a fish, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember, you can subscribe